Blacksmith of the Apocalypse. By Arcuser. Chapter 1001 Vegagores. How many were that? Seth asked the demon when the notifications fell silent and the flames inside slowly died down. Roughly 1,300 souls. About 900 small ones, 400 medium-sized ones, and 5 big ones. Wow, that's quite good for a single target. Especially the 5 big souls, Seth exclaimed, pleasantly surprised. Over the past 2 days, Seth and Tano had laid waste to 36 garrisons and settlements, some based on smaller and medium dungeons. Over the course of their travel, they managed to collect 6,300 small, about 1,100 medium, and just 15 big souls. Getting 5 from a single target was a good result on the surface. Of course, the dungeons in the Abyss offered a much better booty, but they were also hard and cost time. The quantity made up for the quality on this trip. Yes, it's going quite well, the demon agreed. Then let's go inside. There is still a dungeon that needs to be cleaned, Seth said, motivated, and made the Titan take the lead. The draconic fire Titan busted down the city gates with ease. Like the city, they had been almost disintegrated by the heat of the flames. All the city walls now surrounded were ashed and the remains of crude wooden huts. The only place spared from the fire was the relatively more advanced residence of the city lord. A simple castle, built with the entrance to the dungeon in its center. When they arrived, they found Vigu already waiting for them, sitting on the corpse of an armored ogre, the dead city lord. Vigu, good to see you were not hurt, Seth greeted him with a wave of his hand. Do you think they managed to alarm the ones inside the dungeon? The bard asked. The Oni shook his head. I killed the city lord when he tried to do that. The guy below shouldn't be prepared for a raid. Shall we go in then? As mentioned, the dungeon here was a typical subterranean structure. It had 70 floors with a box at every 10 floors and monsters ranging between leave 75 and 80. Again, Seth didn't halt to harvest each and every monster. He only did so with the boss monsters, which yielded a big soul every 10 floors, giving him as many big souls in one location, as they had collected in the 36 previous ones. The greatest hurdles would have been the traps, but there were next to no traps. Vigu said that the priority of Kazdam was getting orcs into this world, not wasting energy defending the dungeons with traps. Seth made his Ashwalker and Burning Savage titles proud for most of the path, as he simply ran past the creatures and they died from his flame aura. Then, finally, they reached the boss room. The Guardian of the Core was ready for their arrival. Vegagores leave 98, boss. Vigu, who would have thought that you would betray his majesty like this? The general asked, lifting his massive axe on his shoulder. Vigu silently stared at him, standing behind Seth. The Oni general didn't react. Ever since he was revived, his loyalty to Seth was unwavering. Not only did you betray us, but you even led this guy to our border. Do you have any act? Enough talking. We are on a tight schedule here. Vega still managed to react when Seth suddenly appeared before him, but it didn't save him. The axe that was brought before his body to block an attack, was broken through by the giant's rod, while Vega lost his life being pierced by rock needles. In one move, Seth collected the soul and body. It was the first massive soul since he went on this journey. Come on, let's see if you really could take over the dungeon. This Leave 80 dungeon was the biggest and highest level among the quests they had picked up. If he wanted to test it with Vigu, then on this one. The question was, what if it worked? He could hardly leave Vigu here. The Oni would simply be besieged until he died and the dungeon would go back to Kazdam. At this time, Seth wistfully thought of Solar Solace. The boss of the Abyss dungeon had sworn him fealty, but he had no way of contacting him. If it was that guy, he might have even had some minion that could have taken over and held this dungeon. But it was just wishful thinking. The blacksmith stepped toward the dungeon core and went through the usual routine, once again only earning a meager harvest. These orcs really didn't know how to save up. There was no money to be made, so it was time for the next step. Can you take him as your master? The bard asked, rattling his weapon menacingly. Since it was irresponsible to make Vigu stay here, this was merely an experiment. If it worked, they would just find a big dungeon in Minas Mar for him to take over. There were a lot of advantages to owning a dungeon Seth could think of. Mostly he wanted to try to deliberately nurture weapons with the power of dungeon end. The core flickered a hesitating light red, destroying all the blacksmith's short-lived hopes and whimsy dreams. I'm sorry, Seth. I really thought I would be able to, the ONI boss said with guilt in his voice. Vigu had been convinced that he could become the boss of a dungeon, since he had not lost the power of the blessing, but it seemed that that was not the case. It's okay, Vigu. It's not like I had any high hopes in the first place. I was just looking forward to the possibilities. Despite trying to calm him, the bard spoke in a lethargic voice, shrugging his shoulders devastated. Seth, I'm really... PFF, calm down. I'm just joking. Let's leave here. We have some more places to visit today. The night had fallen. Seth and Tunamole sat at a nice campfire in the middle of the prairie. The night sky was almost clear. Of course, it was purely for the atmosphere. They wouldn't camp outside, and neither were they cooking food. They had food and would return to Legion's space to get some rest. Seth was intently staring at the interface of blueprint and was working on a blueprint for the Golem forge when the communication orb in his pocket started vibrating. Seth took his eyes off the interface and answered the call. Lena? Do you need something? He asked the princess after their greeting. No, I just wanted to know when you are returning. We are ready to announce the date for the Pathian Games and start the promotion. Of course, you are the one who needs to announce it. Oh, I see. Well, I should be back in 2 or 3 days. What day is today? Monday? Schedule it for Friday, I should be back by then, he answered her quickly. In 2 days was the Maestro's deadline. Afterward, he planned for a day of rest. All right, that should be enough time to gather the journalists. I will go ahead with that date then. Since this was really all she needed from him, they said their farewells and the call ended. After the call, Seth's gaze returned back to the panel he had been working on. What are you even doing? Tunamole asked the blacksmith who had been intently staring into the air and moving his hands. He might have thought he was staring into the campfire, but the hand movements made it seem that he was working on something. Oh, I'm just trying to make a blueprint that mimics the automatic mode of the Golem forge, the blacksmith explained. In the beginning, Seth lacked experience with the machine, to know how it turned a corpse into what could be called a golem or corpse puppet. Thinking of these golem puppets, he had an idea. Since it was a pain to make armor sets for them, he was trying to find a way to armor them, without having to make the armors by hand. It was one thing to equip the strong ones with good gear, but the throwaways who wouldn't even get a soul were not really worth the effort. This was why Seth tried to make a blueprint that would make the golem forge fuse metal plates to the corpse puppet's leather skin. It would essentially be like a scale armor, but closer to lizard skin than overlapping ones like dragon or fish scale. He actually had this idea because of Sivri's articulate outer shell. I see, it sounds really complicated, Tunamole commented after the blacksmith explained it to him. Because it is. Let's go to rest, I will continue on this at another time, the blacksmith finally said, feeling tired after a day of farming. A portal to Legion's inner space opened and the two stepped in, vanishing from the prairie. Chapter 1002 I Just Have to Eat. Holy Land, 3 days later. On the evening of the 5th day, Seth and Tunamole had raised almost 50 garrisons and settlements to the ground. The haul of these 5 days of work was over 16,000 small, about 2,600 medium, 40 big, and 2 massive souls of various qualities. They were leaving the last dungeon on the list, when the blacksmith also finally got a message from the demon Maestro, just before the end of his deadline. He gave them coordinates to a place in the Holy Land, saying they would find the target there. Seth and Tunamole arrived at an hour later, riding the Golem Griffin. Ack, my butt hurts, the demon complained as he quickly slipped of the Griffin's back. Although the Griffins were better than the Golem horses, the blacksmith couldn't argue against Tano's complaints. The place they reached was not too far from the Maestro's territory. It was easy to find, since it was marred by signs of a recent battle. The rock faces and boulders looked molten, corroded by acids, and a penetrating smell of chemicals filled the air. Remnants of the Maestro's test subjects littered the ground. Severed limbs and blackened bones were severely damaged from chemical burns. Some of them were still burning with colorful flames, spreading a putrid stench. It was quite obvious that whoever the Maestro was fighting here was an expert in chemical warfare. Ugh, what kind of disgusting bastard did that Maestro get to come? Tunamole commented, holding his nose. I think he called him Nilith. Seth answered the goat's question while looking around. Fuck, seriously, the demon cursed out of character. Even I know who that is. He's a scourge of the battlefield. Wherever he fights, he leaves a toxic wasteland. The worst part is that he is known to randomly appear on battlefield. Nobody wants him and test his concoctions on all sides. Quite a few souls I peddled died an unfair death, because he had some new invention to test. Do you really think you can take him? The demon kept on rambling while Seth was looking around the place. Yeah, I'm pretty sure I can, the bard answered with unwavering certainty. What makes you so sure? Tanomol asked surprised. Because the meal was already cooked. I just have to eat, the blacksmith joked and pointed to a boulder. When the demon followed the direction he pointed at, he found that there was a figure leaning against a boulder. It was a humanoid demon wearing a ragged black robe. He was missing an arm and everything below his waist. The face was horribly disfigured, with half of his skull sunken in. Tanomol would have been sure he was dead if his chest was not moving up and down laboriously. It was a miracle the person was still alive. Nelith, the Scourge, leave 125. Health 50/1000. Mana, 300/45000. Status, fatally wounded, bleeding, poisoned, cursed, confused. Nelith, I presume? Seth asked the beaten Maestro. The demon's yellow eye with a snake pupil looked up to the imposing figure that suddenly appeared before him. Nelith quickly added one and one together. That damn! Who would have thought that he would end our rivalry not by killing me, but by selling me out? Where are you from? Grana? Spacia? Staxi? Hapan? I heard Bragmomal was in this world. Did he send you? The demon kept listing enemies to the point it even surprised Seth. Wow, you were collecting enemies like trophies, hey? Unfortunately, I belong to none of them. I don't hold a grudge against you. Your good free rival simply sold you out to save his own skin. I guess an introduction is needed. Seth crouched down beside Nelith, looking him in the one working eye. Hello, I'm Seth Smith, a blacksmith, and I will be taking your soul, the bard said with a bright voice and smile, prompting the demon to vomit blood. The demon tried to protest, but the wraith guard had already pierced his chest. As a demon, Nelith's soul was strong and willful. Seth had already expected that the extraction was going to be difficult, even if Nelith was close to death. This was why he was wearing the wraith guard, which made the extraction much easier. Slowly, despite his struggles, Nelith's soul separated from his destroyed body and entered the spirit blacksmith's possession. Soul of Nelith, massive, ego, crafting material. Epic. Soul of the Maestro Nelith, a mixed-race demon specialized in alchemy and alchemical warfare. A universal villain, whose death brings joy to many. Soul contains 89% of the demon's original knowledge, skills, and personality. Roughly 90% of his original skills? This was good, but Seth was more surprised by the exact percentage. It was the first time the system gave him a concrete number instead of telling him the soul's skills or affinities. Original skills was actually marked like a link, and Seth was able to expand it in a second window. The window showed a long list of skills and traits such as alchemy, craftsman, LV.8, fire manipulation leave 6, combat alchemy, trait, corrosive expert, trait, vapor villain. It was so much that it was exported to a different window. Was this the improved result with soul capture leave 9 and the wraith guard? Now he felt some regret, that he had not been using the wraith guard when harvesting the dungeon bosses in the past few days. Nelith, Seth tried talking to the ego, but the demon stayed unresponsive. However, he knew this was because couldn't answer like the Mind Reaper Bow which had just recently developed an ego, but because Nelith didn't want to communicate. The bard didn't mind, since it was not important for now. What mattered was that he had mostly finished his business in the Holy Land with this, and all that was left was reporting about the completion of his quests to the Adventurer Guild. After all, these were also paid and he wasn't going to just leave the rewards from the guild behind. I'm back, Seth greeted the receptionist with a smile. It was the same one he got the quests from. She was coincidentally free when the blacksmith entered and he thought things would go faster if he went to her. Ah! Mr. Smith! Are you back to check in finished quests and stock up on supplies? She greeted him with an even brighter than usual business smile. This was the treatment reserved for the VIP. Not stocking up. I'm returning since I finished all of the quests, the bard smiled satisfied when he saw her shocked expression. Didn't you take almost 50 quests? She asked shocked, quickly lowering her voice when she realized how loud she was. Exactly 50, yes, the blacksmith agreed. I hope you understand, but I will have to check the completion then, she asked, still having a hard time believing. She started fiddling with the orb interface at her counter. This was one of the things only big guild like this had. It was an interface that used the system to check the status of quests given by the guild. It replaced the custom of bringing monster parts as proof of subjugation or the quest giver's certificate that the task was done satisfactorily. Overall, it was better than the old way, since people had a much harder time finding loopholes with the system being an objective judge on whether the task was fulfilled or not. The receptionist was staring in awe when she checked the accomplishments. It was hard to believe that a single man had driven back the border of Khaz Dam by tens of kilometers in a matter of 5 days. I'm sorry to have doubted you. Everything is in order. The rewards had up to 323 gold. Would you like the rewards in cash or card transfer? Cash meant that the lady would start piling money on the counter. Avoiding the hassle, Seth chose the card transfer. With a simple touch of the 2 crystal cards, Seth's empty system bank account received an addition of 323 gold. Although it couldn't compare to the money he had made by selling golems, it was not an amount he was going to leave behind. Thanks for the business, have a nice day, the receptionist spoke with a bow. You, too, Seth reciprocated her farewells and left the guild. It was time to return, the world was waiting for an announcement. Chapter 1003 Nobody is broadcasting anymore. New Hope, Scouting Vessel Beetle. Johansson. Stop tinkering on that thing already and come up. You won't receive anything anyway, nobody is broadcasting anymore, the voice came from the upper deck, prompting the man in question to look up from soldering a circuit board. The room surrounding him was filled with wire, spare parts, and old technology like radios, mobile phones, and portable TVs. Some showed signs of repair and retrofitting with skills and magic. He had always been fascinated with technology and the young lady had given him the chance to expand in this field. Even though all of these devices had stayed dead so far. Who is to say there is nobody out there? Didn't the people from New Hope say that the central districts managed to survive relatively well? Maybe. Stop you dreaming and come back up to man the radar. We have to stay vigilant in case another undead army attacks us, the voice of the captain interrupted him sternly. Johansson sighed. The captain was not much older than him, but he was a very serious man. He couldn't blame him. Their task was quite important. The Beetle was a small, quick vessel tasked with scouting and mapping the surroundings of their current base, New Hope. Expanding the reaches of their knowledge, they would also be the first ones to find and report threats back to the leadership. Johansson stood up and left the room and ascended the stairs. When is welcome to participate in any of these categories. Again, no matter where you originate from, you are free to participate and prove your skills to the world, a voice blasted from the room at full volume. One of the TVs actually received a signal. Captain. 2 hours later the crew was brooding over the transcript of the broadcast Johansson had managed to receive. They were lucky as it was a repeating signal, playing the message over and over again. However, the contents had them puzzled. Overall, it was the announcement of a grand event that invited anyone, no matter their race or origin, to a contest of arts and power in a place called Little Gamma. The problem was not understanding the purpose of the message, but the details they couldn't know. What was Minas Mar? Where was Little Gamma? What was the purpose of holding games in honor of Python? Who was Python? Why were they wasting their time on such a quirky event when the world was going to shit? However, one thing was clear. There are many questions, but we have to report this to the young lady. To promise a legendary weapon as a prize, when we are barely able to craft epic ones, should be a huge deal, the captain mumbled seriously. Don't forget that this is the first proof of other districts still thriving. The date the broadcast names is in 2 months, system time. The message can't be old, another mentioned. And don't forget who we owe this to, Johansson said proudly, having proven that his tinkering was far from as useless as they had always pretended it to be. Captain sighed. Yeah, Johansson. For the 5th time, good work. Arundith. Haha, grandfather. You promised I could go. Poulter cheered, watching the broadcast of Minas March. Previously, the news had only come through various channels, but it seemed that Minas Mar had not held back on the marketing this time. The broadcast showing Seth announcing the Pathian games was running on major channels across Krina and reached even the furthest edges of the multidimensional empire. The Blacksmith finally not just announced the date but also the specific structure of the tournament. For example, it was split into martial and artistic contests. The former were shows of strength, like the fighting tournament, weaponless fighting, racing, obstacle racing, and magic contests. The latter were contests of artistic skill, such as singing, dance, painting, poetry, and music. Except for a minimum skill and maximum level to participate, anyone was free to enter the Pathian games. Seth made it clear that everyone was welcome. Of course, all of the speech peaked in the blacksmith once again confirming that the grand prize of the main event, the fighting tournament, was a custom legendary weapon made with the winner's specifications. "Yeah, but are you serious about entering the tournament?" He said. "Anyone can enter. If it's about a legendary weapon, I'm sure a lot of big shots will fill the ranks. I don't want to put you down, but I don't think you have a chance of winning," the old dwarf said realistically. "Still, I can also just go to watch. Don't you think it's interesting that they also allocated disciplines for artists?" Poulter countered. He had been working his ass off for the past weeks for the chance to go. He wouldn't be deterred, just because his chances to win were slim. "Ho ho ho, you are right. I think I will come along to see that. Although the prizes for the artist are more about honor, I'm sure there will be some great names," the old dwarf said, looking forward to the art from other parts of the patchworks. They had gotten a small taste of it during their visit of Krina. The old man had a hard time believing that these attention whores would let go of a chance for publicity. Cinema Dimension. "Now things really start getting into motion," Seth, the god of chaos, announced when they watched Seth giving the press conference and recording the broadcast. He already enjoyed Seth taking a more active stance, especially the short trip to Kaz Dam. I'm actually a little worried about Mike's situation," Mahiz admitted. He had no other believers in technologically highly developed worlds. The thought of a soulless creature made of metal, being able to infect and corrupt a host was in a sense even more unsettling than the soul-shattering virus. "It is quite concerning and a little intriguing," Hephaestus, the grandfather of technology, agreed, although not as disturbed as Mahiz by this development. It was more that he was bothered that they knew so little about that situation. "I'm more interested in whether these cultivators will join the tournament," Apollo said with a twinkle in his eyes. The contests of artistic skill were right up his alley, and they knew from Mountain's tales that cultivators also put some weight and skill into the fine arts. "I'm sure if they join the combat it will become even more interesting," Seth agreed, rubbing his hands in anticipation, at which Apollo could only roll his eyes. Meanwhile, Hermes snuck up on the vacated seat beside the dungeon god. The system god had left a while ago and had not returned until now. "Hey, dungeon god, I would like to ask you something," he approached him with a cheeky smile. "What is it?" the brown robe answered after a moment of silence. He didn't really want to deal with Hermes. "You could have allowed that golem to become the dungeon master, right?" the trickster god asked him in a whisper. "Sure." The great god didn't even attempt to deny it. He could have easily bent the rules a little, or spontaneously given the golem a blessing to become the dungeon master. But he didn't. Envigu? He would have been able to become a dungeon master, right? Yep. Again, he easily admitted that he had deliberately not allowed it. "Aren't you interested in seeing what the little blacksmith would do with the possibilities of a dungeon?" "I am." "Then yeah." Hermes whined. "Gods move in mysterious ways. Also, I still have a bet with system." Chapter 1004 Fine Alchemy Table. Upon his return, Seth was immediately briefed on the announcement. Mary and the others really spared no expenses. Not only were ads running on local and across Krina Empire's channels, but they had even hired some of Y-City's engineers to broadcast on several older technologies such as radio and TV. Although the range was limited, even people who were cut off from the districts, like Mount Agra, would be able to receive the message with older systems. Now Seth's task was simply to read out the things that had been long since decided, and the date for the Pathian Games, set to be 2 months later, system time. They set up a long period to allow the news to spread and give people time to arrive on Earth and in Little Gamma. Among their preparation were not only the venues for the various contests, but Karina and the others had specially set up a whole region with temporary lodging for participants and tourists. Although it was a secondary goal, Minas Mar was looking for a hefty profit, despite the expenses on construction and advertisement. Jane had even asked Seth for more merchandise to set up another turquoise anvil in Little Gamma so that participants and tourists would have a chance to buy their merchandise. Seth gladly agreed, seeing it as another outlet for his, Natal's, and Allison's practice products. The blacksmith himself was free to get back to what he planned to do after the speech was recorded in several takes. What he did after a while of rest was return to his workshop. His first action was to load up the Golem forge with the new blueprint and the corpses he had looted from their raid on the orc dungeons. The blacksmith managed to free 76 slots of his 100 inventory slots before the trip. With over 18,000 kills, his inventory had been bursting. Even using the Legion's space, he couldn't take all the corpses with him. Meaning he had already sorted them and only taken the best ones he could get. However, the first ones to enter the Golem forge were not the ones profiting from his new blueprint, which would give them a skin of metal scales. Seth didn't have the materials for them, yet. For the material of the scales Seth had decided on stainless steel. The stainless steel Seth knew from his everyday life, were usually judged as common steel or iron with impurities. This stainless steel, however, was an uncommon material acknowledged by the system and had a specific recipe, just like uncommon carbon steel. There were two reasons for this. The first was that stainless steel would not corrode, even if the new product would spend long times outside. The other was the price. Minas Mar was sitting on tons of common ores that were a byproduct of their excessive mining operations across the tree route. It made sense that a vein of ore for magic iron or dark iron was obviously surrounded by ore for normal iron and other metals, too. They already had large quantities in storage, all Seth needed to pay for was to have it refined by the people with the smelting skill. As that needed time, he started with the corpses, that were worth being fitted with armors. The next step was activating the soul refinery and filling it with 12,000 of the small souls he brought back from the Holy Land. Like the Golem forge, the soul refinery was a powerful tool, that allowed him to fuse and refine souls to a certain end. Its most basic use was to completely clean the souls of old memories and residues, making them a pure power source that could be used to enhance other souls with little to no side effects. Another way to use it was to have it filtered and refined so the result would keep or enhance specific skills and traits. Of the over 16k souls he got, these 12k souls he loaded in were all souls of warriors and non-combatants, that would be refined into big souls with concentrated warrior skills. Once these were done, he would put in the rest, which were souls holding talent and skills in magic. The neat part was that he could leave the specific sorting and fusing of the souls to the refinery, which would choose the optimal combinations. With the 2 crafting stations running, he could finally focus on what he wanted to work on, the new crafting station. Since he finally had a fitting soul for an alchemy station, he could start on building it. From what Seth had understood from Sivri's explanation and the feeling he got from the skill, was that he could either forge the soul itself into the crafting station or try to create the crafting station first and then imbue it with the soul. The latter being much more difficult, especially with a complicated build, like the Golem forge. What the demonic bard originally wanted, was an acid rack for etching, that could refill itself. Of course, since he also learned alchemy, his ambitions had grown a little and he was thinking of a full alchemy station. In the beginning, the blacksmith had many worries. For example, how to implement an inventory space for the crafting station. If it was like Legion, he actually needed to know spatial enchantments to implement it, which he didn't. Subspaces were usually the domain of magic enchantment, not something he could achieve with circuits. His uncomfortable suspicion was that Forgebrand probably split off part of his soul, which not only imbued his skills into the crafting station but also part of the blessing of the system, like the inventory. Nelith was not a player, he didn't have an inventory to start. Another was how it would act on its own. Would he have to forge the soul into a fully enchanted automaton? These worries were quickly banished when he realized that he was forging a soul, which had consciousness in every part of itself. The station would be the soul's body, so it would be able to move on its own. As for the inventory space, it was not necessarily needed. He would just have to live with the fact that he would have to carry the ingredients and results himself, or put up racks in the workshop. The only hurdle now was Nelith's cooperation. The souls still refused to even communicate with him, which made an additional step necessary. As a spirit blacksmith, Seth could have tried to manipulate the soul personally, which was more accurate than the soul refinery. However, Seth recently theorized a much simpler method. Since Nelith wasn't cooperating, Seth could just install a superior ego and force him to work. This meant he prepared to engrave the generic automaton core circuit onto the soul. In theory, the automaton circuit might get influenced by the original ego, or even meld together with it. However, Seth was quite sure it would stay obedient, since the core enchantment would not change at any point. As far as Seth understood it, the enchantment could be seen as a second, dominant personality, that had access to all the memories and skills and had a higher decision-making power. He already had this idea with Bazalith, but the soul of the Blaze Cat was cooperative, unlike Nelith. Wait, what are you doing to me? Nelith finally decided to speak, when his soul found itself on the surface of his anvil. Before Seth placed the automaton circuit, he had to finish the shape of the crafting station after all. Oh, now you want to speak to me? Well, it won't hurt if you know your fate. I will turn you into an alchemy crafting station. Your primary job will be making acids for etching items. I might also use you to make potions, Seth explained to him, as he turned part of the soul into the shape of a workbench. What crazy! Ugh, how can someone force a soul into a physical shape like this? The soul exclaimed. It was the first time a soul kept trying to communicate with him during the forging process. It didn't seem to hurt, but Nelith sounded quite confused. Oh, it's just part of my class. Don't worry about it. You will become a fine alchemy table, Seth assured him. I don't want to. I will never help you, no matter what you do to me, the demon screeched, vehemently trying to resist. However, he couldn't so much as twitch under the control of soul capture, soul forging, and the Wraith Guard. Too bad, I don't really need your consent. You had your chance to make a deal before. Chapter 1005 Alchemy Station. Creating an alchemy table from the parts of a soul was much more challenging than Seth had expected, and it wasn't because Nelith kept trying to argue and negotiate with him. It was simply very different from making weapons, or armor. The central cauldron was still one of the easier parts. It became very finicky when he started working on the parts for the distillery. These were the parts that would be made of intricate glass objects on a normal alchemy station. Frustration was no stranger to Seth, so he clenched his teeth and kept at it, even if he had to do it several times over. Beakers, fine tubes, spiraling tubes, valves, Seth recreated all the setup they also had in their own laboratories here in Minas March. While he was working on it, he was still battling the doubts about whether this all was even needed. Would the crafting station even need to go through all the processes to make a potion? Would these parts made of the soul work the same way that the physical devices did? Or would it all just end up as decoration, while the soul could use the skills internally to take in ingredients and spit out finished potions? No, at least it wouldn't turn into a magical cauldron. Nelith didn't have the right skills to make him believe that. Still, he was putting a lot of work into it, while he was actually just grasping in the dark. This was his first time trying to make a crafting station, and he was not too sure how it would work out in the end. If it even did. As frustrating as it was, doing something very different also gave Seth deeper insights into his soul forging skill and the shaping of a soul. Using the skill together with energy manipulation 3 and Karen's obel allowed him to create the more intricate structures. Despite the difficulty, a complete alchemy station took shape over the course of half a day. What are you trying to do with that thing? Nelith asked panicky when Seth brought out the engraving tool. There was no reason to lie to him. I'm going to engrave an enchantment invented by Hephaestus, the god of craftsmen, onto you. It's Golem core circuit that will hopefully make you a good and obedient crafting station, he answered, a friendly smile swinging along in his voice. Nelith fell silent. Interestingly, he did not start begging. He was a villain, a scourge of the battlefield. He probably knew that begging was not going to work. Nobody would think he didn't deserve this. How about a deal? He asked the moment the engraver was about to touch him. Sorry, there is no deal you will like, Seth revealed. There was nothing he could offer the demon. There was no freedom he could get, no agency he could negotiate. What Seth wanted was a crafting station. I will do anything, just don't do that. His words were now shaking with existential threat. The blacksmith finally hesitated for a moment. He knew that one thing demons held dear the most was their personality and individuality. Especially a maestro. It would save Seth quite some work if he could use a contract to force the demon into obedience. Sure, sign this then. Seth ultimately decided that it was worth a try. What he created using soul trade was a binding contract stating one simple term. Nelith swore to be obedient to Seth or the user of the soul smithy skill. Despite his desperation, the demon hesitated when he saw that simple term. They were actually the most dangerous for one simple reason. There was no if-then clause. A magical contract always gave a punishment of sorts for breaking the contract. A soul contract usually did the same, however, if there was no consequence for breach, it literally meant that the contract would enforce itself even against the will of the party. Nelith would not get the chance to be disobedient and suffer a punishment, he would simply be unable to do anything that went against his orders or damaging against Seth. It wouldn't even be able to pull a genie move and try malicious compliance. It was the ultimate oath of servitude. I accept. Nelith finally agreed to the soul contract, sparing Seth from the task of engraving the complicated enchantment on the already complicated alchemy station. Having avoided needing to engrave the whole station, Seth could start with the most mysterious part. Usually, skills were self-explanatory. The knowledge surrounding their usage would flow into the user's mind and they would unlock more and more with growing proficiency and practice. However, Seth had never found out how to raise proficiency in soul smithy, as simply summoning and unsummoning his crafting stations didn't do the trick. He had constantly used skill points to raise its level. This might have been very well the first time he was going to use the true potential of the skill. The blacksmith concentrated on the void in his mind, as if he was trying to activate a limb he was never consciously aware of. It was very similar to the grasping in the dark when he tried to use soul infusion on the garment of death. His concentration increased as he started focusing his senses on the soul alchemy station. Remembering the feeling of summoning and storing the other crafting stations, something finally clicked. As if a building block fell into a place it was always meant to be. The alchemy table vanished. Then it reappeared. And it vanished again. Ding! A new crafting station has been registered under your skill soul smithy. You have gained proficiency. Ding! Your first crafting station is an exceptional work of craftsmanship and engineering. You have gained a bonus proficiency. The station will be automatically strengthened. Ding! You skill soul smithy leave 9 had become soul smithy leave max. The bard was shocked at the ease at which he was able to register the alchemy station. Now that he understood it, it was almost shameful how he didn't get it before. It was only now Seth realized how he could have gained proficiency in the skill, before unlocking all the perks. As all the crafting stations were fully or in part made souls, Seth could have strengthened them with soul infusion at any time. Given the right souls, this could have naturally unlocked the upgrades he had forcefully unlocked with skill points. With the soul smithy reaching max level thanks to the bonus of creating an exceptional crafting station as his first, a result of failing to really understand the skill and just raising his crafting skills, every crafting station was once again strengthened and there was one last perk unlocked. His eyes started shining when he saw what this perk allowed him to do. The Golem forge no longer had a size limit. Although it clearly stated that the processing time would rise exponentially with the size, it was no longer limited to medium and below-sized creatures. A Styrian with his over 3 meters height still snugly fit in, but they couldn't be much bigger before. But this was something for the future, he would still have to know how much the time requirement would increase. For now, his focus returned back to the alchemy station, which also had experienced some changes after it was integrated into the skill. While the soul device he created would have been invisible to anyone else, the final crafting station had become much more corporeal, just like the anvil and the furnace. In addition, he was also given the option to sacrifice some of his inventory slots to create inventory space for the alchemy station. Although Seth had worried about giving the crafting station a subspace before, he decided against this now. The reason was quite simple, he now knew that he had the very power to adapt and improve the crafting stations of the soul smithy. Instead of sacrificing his valuable inventory space, Seth rather looked forward to the chance to further improve the alchemy table in the future. He had not forgotten that the subspace of Legion was the result of a material Master Mountain brought him and Alzalsar's magic. Although he didn't know what Al was up to and was hardly able to replicate her achievements, he was very well in the position to wait for more of the materials to come in. After all, the reports of cultivators appearing in the vicinity of Y-City, Delta, and even as far as the unclaimed mountains raised the possibility of getting his hand on one of their spatial treasures or corresponding materials. You had told him that strong cultivators had stuff like space rings, or cosmos pouches that were able to hold huge quantities of stuff. Since Nelith was an ego, he saw no problem in appropriating one of those treasures to become part of his alchemy station. Then the ego would be able to control and access the subspace. At least that was his rough idea. "Shall we test out how well you are able to craft potion?" Seth exclaimed happily. His face fell moments later. Chapter 1006 Limited Power. This is not my fault. It's your stupid skill. Nelith, the alchemy table, failed to make a true journeyman potion despite having craftsman leave 8 alchemy. Why? Something Seth had not foreseen was the fact that all his crafting stations started off with restriction. Most prominently, they could not exert abilities that were above his own skill level. Since he was just an adept alchemist, there was no way for Nelith to succeed in a journeyman recipe. He had just put an almost master level soul into his skill, only for it to be restricted to adept leave 3. It wasn't as bad, but the regret was hard to swallow since he could have also made a piece of equipment, which might have raised his alchemy skill artificially. At least he would be able to earn proficiency passively. He acknowledged that he might have overdone it directly trying a journeyman potion. Instead, he tried on from Alison's grinding plan next, putting the ingredients on the table where Nelith could take and use them. The result of this experiment was very satisfactory. Even if his skill was restricted, he still had the knowledge and experience. Although the recipe was hard for Seth, Nelith completed it with ease. On this level, there was almost 0% of failing. Much better than Seth's 40% of failure on complicated recipes. Despite only earning 1/4 to 1/3 the proficiency when leaving it to Nelith, it was almost the same because his failure rate was technically non-existent. This way he had no qualms about leaving some of the ingredients and recipes in the future to Nelith. He still wanted to gain proficiency himself, but he was happy that the crafting station could lower his burden and quicken his progress. After all, he didn't intend to become an omnipotent alchemist. It was enough when he was able to make high-ranking acids and poisons for crafting. With the worst itch scratched, Seth felt great relief and calmed considerably. Satisfied, he left several sets of ingredients on the alchemy station for Nelith to refine overnight while he went to sleep. Having felt the inadequacy of their current firepower, Seth didn't have the mindset to keep grinding over the next days. Especially when thinking of the Pathian games, he wanted to improve security with more and better golem presence. Instead of grinding other skills, Seth spent his time infusing the harvested medium-sized souls into the prepared corpse puppets. These used to be the bodies of orc warriors ranging between level 60 and 75. After going through storage in the inventory, they all looked the same and had roughly the same stats. They were the ones who deserved to get full armors made. It was going quicker than the production of fire since the blacksmith deliberately didn't sing them to life. Time wasn't the only reason. Although artificial lives had a better potential in growth, they were impractical for logistical reasons. Golems with souls didn't count as living things, so they could be stored and stacked in the inventory. Despite the saved time, there were over 2,600 of them. Even when he only injected the souls into their cores, he was still stuck in the workshop for several days, just working on these guys. He was just halfway done when the first batch of stainless steel arrived and the Golem forge started processing the orc and hobgoblin bodies below level 60. The soul refinery was also done refining the 16,000 small souls into 3,200 medium-sized ones. At this point, Seth withdrew Cerberus from making items, to help work on the lesser ones and quicken the process. Of course, there was another situation Seth had to deal with. Although the armor for the lesser golems was taken care of with stainless scales, the armor for the better ones wasn't. There were 2,600 of them and he intended to equip them with uncommon or rare sets of armor. Minasmar simply didn't have the capacity to make that many quickly. They were a small group of high-level experts and these mass-produced golems were not really worth the high-end stuff. But that wasn't the only problem. What they had accumulated over the past had already been stretched out across their oath guard, members of subsidiary guilds, the shops, and deals like the one with gamma resistance. Even if Seth wanted to put epic armor on these, there was not enough for a whole army. Of course, Seth had not come back with just their bodies. He had also a considerable pile of uncommon armor the orcs and hobgoblins wore originally. However, the warriors of Kazdam were not fans of full armor. Goblins didn't wear armor to begin with, while orcs and hobgoblins preferred what Seth would call barbarian-style armor. Singular pieces that covered several equipment slots while revealing a lot of bare skin. He scrunched up his nose at the thought that he might have to resort to using these. Even if he wanted to, they were still far from enough to equip all of them, and their quality was unsatisfying. Despite the upgrade, Seth still had no way to fool the Golem forge into making straight-up armor for him. Cerberus was also bound to process the lesser corpse puppets. Even if he recruited the other blacksmiths, they were a small group of elites, there was simply not enough time to finish that many on their own. This left Seth with only one option. "Seth, it's been a while since you asked me for a meeting," Simon greeted him with his jolly, good smile. If the bard's eyes weren't wrong, the man's circumference had increased again. "Simon, I'm glad you were able to make time at such short notice," the bard greeted him jovially. Only after they met, did Seth realize that he had kind of missed the man. He had been a great help ever since and he had come to trust him. "So, what brings you here? I doubt you just wanted to see me for a good talk," the priest cut to the chase, once they were both sorted with tea and cake. One never left hungry from visiting the red-robed priest. "True. I need armor." "You? Yet. The demand is a little too high for us to make it in time ourselves, he admitted with a wry smile. What numbers are we talking about, that even the first blacksmith master of Earth is unable to reach it? He asked surprised. 2634 sets of armor. This was the amount of Besouled corpse puppets with medium-sized, unrefined souls. As they were originally medium-size, they were bigger than the refined ones, which only reached the minimum to be called medium-sized. As they also retained their original structure and were infused into compatible bodies, they had the best growth potential and deserved a minimum level of gear. Simon swallowed hard, shocked at the number. He was glad that he was not taking a sip of his tea when Seth said that, or he would have embarrassed himself. Are you preparing for war or something? Aren't you already selling Golem to Arjit Noor? How much more are you intending to do? He asked jitterily. This is different. The standard golems I'm selling to the undead have already proven that they won't be enough to weather the coming storm. Didn't you hear about the cultivators in Little Gamma? It actually took golem wave tactics to suppress the weaker ones. Are they that strong? Simon asked concerned. I fear it is as you warned us. This new wave, this invasion, will have many more and many stronger cultivators than the stragglers we met before. There was one that could almost fight Lydia on even ground in Emerald City. The priest's face turned grave, hearing that a chosen like Lydia with a bunch of legendary armaments and high-grade gear was pressured. After a moment he started nodding. How quickly do you need it? The quicker, the better. I want to give the golems enough time to grow. As their growth speed was very slow, he didn't delude himself that they would grow much stronger, but a little was better than not at all. Any requirements? Not really, it's okay if they are cheap uncommon, or rare armors fit for warriors. Seth didn't intend to put precious armor onto what was technically cannon fodder. Otherwise, people might have gotten the idea to attack his golems to loot the armor. Over time, he might start replacing their gear with dungeon drops or leftovers from their own production. I think I can help you. Actually, I have an idea where to get them relatively cheaply. Though it comes with a catch. Oh? Tell me. Chapter 1007 Scrap Armors. Scrap armors, was Simon's quick and cost-effective solution. Scrap armor? Seth asked, to make sure he understood the priest correctly. Yes. As you know, the Pathworks are not the most peaceful place. There are hundreds of wars across hundreds of worlds raising the demands for items at all times. It might take a week or two to get over 2,000 full sets of new armor, even if your requirements are not high. But it's a different story if we are talking about scrapped items. All of these wars leave battlefields filled with bodies and damaged items that are being scavenged at all times. If I use my connections I could probably collect the number you need in a few days, but they would need to be repaired. Simon suggested a trade-off. Instead of getting new gear that was in high demand everywhere, getting used goods that may need repairs. Of course, repairing would also cost time, but would it take longer than the time they saved? What range of repairs are we talking about? What conditions would these scrap armors come in? The blacksmith asked, not deterred by the possible work he would have to put in. I don't really know off the bat. There are items that won't be much more than scrap and others that may just have a few dents or holes. The latter would be the more common condition, Simon estimated. Fine, let's go with a mix. I will give you a week. Get me as many armor pieces as you can get in this time, I don't care whether they are new, or scrap that is still the shape of an armor. And don't collect them, send them to me the moment they arrive, the blacksmith finally decided. Although they couldn't make thousands of armor pieces with their number of blacksmiths, just repairing finished products was doable. Especially with him and Cerberus. Although Seth disliked the idea, the golems would probably end up with a colorful mix of items, instead of proper sets. However, there was nothing he could do about it if he wanted them finished by the time of the Pathian games. And the price? Seth halted for a moment. Despite spending quite a lot on alchemy ingredients, he had been making a fortune selling golems to Arjit Noor and slowly selling his practice items at the auction house. Together with the money he got for the quests, his personal capital reached roughly 8,000 gold in gold, silver, and crystal cards. He was quite rich, but it didn't mean it was enough. By a rough estimate, uncommon gear usually costs tens of silvers per item, depending on materials, performance, and enchantment. To fill all the equipment slots with uncommon armor would usually cost no more than 4 gold. A well-made set of uncommon armor up to 10 gold on the high end, about as much as a low-end rare item. With 2,600 sets, they were talking about a price of 10,400 to 26,000 for functional items. It wasn't something he could support with his personal funds. But what was Myanmar for? Renting out whole cities, even cheaply, was a money-printing business. It was just that he had to talk with Mary about spending their business money. You know what? The price does not matter for now. Try getting them at market value, and offer slightly more if necessary. I will talk with Mary to settle the bill. Simon nodded. They didn't talk for much longer, as the priest wanted to get to work immediately. While he did that, Seth would have to do something he had severely neglected to do. Informing Mary what the hell he was even up to currently. Pock, 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 Mary kept stabbing at the paper with her pen, pondering, as she stared Seth straight in the eyes. Finally, she sighed. So that's what you were doing, holed up in the workshop? I'm sorry. I was just preoccupied. Yet. You didn't even open a door when I sent someone to get you 3 days ago. You sent someone 3 days ago? Seth asked confused, roughly remembering that Sivri had answered the door at some point. Why? Lydia and Ray returned with McCarthy. He is recovering. You came too late to meet them though, they already left for Little Gamma, to help test the venue for the games, Mary explained. Testing? I thought you sent Yulekat's fur to guard them, Seth commented, a little disappointed that Lydia didn't wait for him. He would have liked to hear from her in person about what had happened in Morin too. I left the memory storage and damaged energy core to Baker's people since it seemed like advanced technology and not magic, Mary answered when Seth asked about the loot of the hashing bird. He was interested in the energy core, but he agreed that Baker's tech magicians were probably better for this job. Mary also added that Holly, the receptionist of the Adventurer Guild, had returned to the guild. Although Seth didn't really care, it was good to have the guild owe them, again. After letting off some steam and complaining to him and about him, Mary let out a sigh and got back to business. You should have told me earlier what you were up to. I could have helped you, she said with a little pout. At least that explains why you suddenly ordered for stainless steel. With such a huge batch of golems, I feel a lot less worried. You shouldn't. We have to stay vigilant. Another thing is, I wanted to send the golems into the dungeons. Can you help me prepare some? While the better golems he would make soon could train in the abyss, the weaker ones needed a fitting environment. Another bonus was that the golems would be able to collect loot in the dungeons. The patchwork of armor they would be wearing could only improve with dungeon loot. I might have a better idea for the golems to gain experience, Mary suddenly said with a mysterious smile. Well, it's an initiative Love came up with, so I can't take full credit, she added and placed a stack of paper from her drawer on the table. The title read: Punitive Expedition to Y City. Seth read out loud questioningly. The content was what could be expected from the title. Epsilon, or what was left of the district, had completely turned into a lawless place filled with monsters, invaders, and savages. Many citizens were still trapped in the ruins of their homes. Daily small numbers of people reached the tree station at the city's border to seek for refuge. The paper suggested that Myanmar organize a punitive force that would clean out the city and look for survivors. According to her estimates, Y City was probably lost. After their technology stopped working in the chaos, the city had been especially hard by dungeons, creatures, and invaders from the Pathworks. Especially the eccentric beings that appeared with the awakening of the slumbering realm showed a strong presence in Y City. Possibly because of the world boss Lezekan's presence. When Love suggested it, it was not much more than a humanitarian publicity stunt. But since Seth now needed oodles and noodles of creatures to sacrifice to the Golem army, this seemed like a great opportunity to hit two birds with one stone. The golems could slaughter their way through the city, gain experience, and collect loot, and Myanmar would further increase their public image. It's really not a bad idea, and who knows what we find in Y City? Maybe the golems will come back with better equipment than the one they came with, the blacksmith praised. Because of the sudden rise of Lezekan, they had not been able to thoroughly search and loot the headquarters of the scene. Seth still missed the gear Mike lost dearly. Especially the helmet of Cryas and the ice glider boots he improved into legendary footwear. Nobody knew what happened to the stuff the scene had taken from Mike. On that note, did Mike call back? Seth asked out of context. It had been almost a month since Mike's last update. No, there is still no contact from him. And series? Mary just shook her head. Chapter 1008 Part of a journey is the walk home. Unclaimed Mountains, Emerald City. Ugh, finally, the staggering figure moaned when he finally saw Emerald City in the distance. He couldn't count the days he had been walking to finally reach Emerald City. The fight with the people who called themselves apiaries was harrowing, as they were crying and begging for mercy as they kept attacking him viciously. Unless he dismembered them completely, they also kept standing up. Even their severed heads would keep begging and asking for forgiveness. To make matters worse, they had managed to damage his communication orb during the journey, which was the reason it was not working. They had also sabotaged the ATV, forcing Mike to walk the way back. Well, not completely. The one forcing him to walk the way back was actually Mahi's. Obviously, Mike tried to return using home call when the need to escort someone else fell away, however. Ding! Part of a journey is the walk home. If you use home call your quest, holy armaments of Mahi's will fail. Proceed to use home call Y/N. A notification rang and a window popped up, prompting him to choose. He had already gone through so much, he couldn't have it fail at this stage. The beastman chose no, condemning himself to a journey of hardship and then facing the consequences of his mistake. A journey, riddled with guilt. Every place Mike came by had already been overrun by the metallic snakes, the cyber worms. The people, creatures he met were quite different from the apiaries. Unlike them, these people were monsters, only partly turned into machines and driven to insanity by the pain of the process. Many had begged him for death. The carboy had no idea what was the difference between them, and Kruger's men who seemed perfectly fine on the surface. Was it just time? Were they all like this in the early stages? Experiencing something like this, locked into the depths of a mine must have been terrible. Not that it was any better in these small settlements. Most terrible of all was Sventon Incorporated Town, the last city where he met people, where the broken road started. So far, the machines had always been a step faster than him and had infected the few people that were still left in the small settlements, where Mike had met no one the first time. When he reached the city at the start of the broken, they were actually in the middle of resisting the worms. Their shield was holding out against the assaults of the worms and the infected cyborg creatures they controlled. Mike had wanted to help, but the people inside were vigilant and didn't allow him to enter. With the hope, that knowledge that people were able to resist, Mike ruefully hurried along his way. Maybe, if he was faster, he would be able to warn people, so that they would be able to prepare. And he was right, he was able to reach other towns along the trade route through the unclaimed mountains, that were not yet overrun. Most had not even heard about the cyber worms, yet. This calmed his worries, but it also made it very hard on him. When he tried to warn them, they wouldn't listen. Mechanical worms that entered people's bodies and took control of them? That was wild, even in the Pathworks. Some barely listened to him because they knew him as one of the lords of Minas Mar, others only felt more doubt, thinking this was a scheme of Minas March. Frustrated, he could only leave his warning and continue his journey. Mike himself also faced many beasts and the attacks of the cyber worms, but none of them were as bad as the first fight with the apiaries. The worms themselves were not strong and they could not modify the creatures they took control of in such a short time. But it was all behind him now. He had grown numb. Emerald City was his last stop before he finally left these cursed mountains. He hoped he could then use home call. If not, he would continue to THRES. At this point, maybe THRES had a system church? Then he could use teleport there. He wasn't blocked from using it on the way there, so it probably was blocked on the way back, either. Right? He had finally reached Emerald City, and although the mechanical plague had not reached here yet, other things seemed to be going on. The city's defenses were raised and a big crowd was waiting at the only entrance. Ragged travelers, merchantries, adventurers, the few people that dared traverse through the unclaimed mountains, connecting the few cities with each other. All of them were halted at the entrance to the barrier by a team of guards. Please, identify yourself or we cannot let you enter, was their routine, whenever one of the merchants or travelers stepped forward. Has something happened? He knew this was not the case when they came through here the first time. It didn't seem likely that Mike would be able to enter today. Despite being in a hurry, he knew that making a scene would be of no help. Tired, Mike approached one of the caravans that were waiting for their turn. They had already put up camp for the night, with fires and tents surrounded by their convoy of trucks and a moderate barrier. Good evening, he chatted up one of the guys standing at the edge of the camp. The man eyes him vigilantly but greeted back. I just arrived and wondered if you knew what was happening here? When I came by, about 2 months ago they didn't have this kind of security, he explained, having a hard time recollecting how long he had been traveling for. Yet, a bunch of stuff happened in Emerald City. Seeing that Mike showed no sign of trying to enter the barrier and didn't approach with bad intentions, the guy was much more open about a little evening chat. It wasn't like he had anything important to do, anyway. Thanks to him, Mike found out the general situation and what had happened in Emerald City since he came through. It all started several weeks ago when a great fight broke out between one of the ruling guild's elites and a small number of unknown assailants. They say one of them was able to turn into a monstrously savage wolf that ripped their opponents apart, and the other created a sludge of darkness that was able to swallow even high-level players alive. The man repeated what he himself heard. Although the rumor was faulty and twisted, it was enough for Mike to make the connection. Ray and Lydia had wreaked havoc. The question was, why? The man continued to explain. After a tough battle, the assailants finally managed to flee. Passing the city borders, they used a massive flying vessel and vanished almost instantly. Another point that raised questions to Mike, but he continued listening, as this was not all. He leaned over to whisper the rest of his info. That was bad and all, but not the actual reason for this security. I heard it from some of the others, who happened to listen in on the guards. It seems that sometime later another group entered Emerald City and started targeted attacks on guild properties. That's the reason they continued the lockdown on the city and control anyone who enters and leaves. What do you think the aim of that group is? Terrorism? Mike asked, also in a whisper. The man looked left and right to make sure no one was there, as if he was about to share some really juicy gossip. Word on the street always had it that the guilds and core have some kind of dark secret they are hiding. Like, there must be some uncouth reason Emerald City is doing so well, right? The best explanation is probably some internal conflict that is being fought out in the dark. And of course, it's us, poor bystanders, that have to suffer from it. Mike played along and complained about big business. Exactly. You have a good head on your shoulders, the man praised him cheerfully. He did. This was also why he decided that he would probably have to get in touch with the new group of people. Mike doubted it was a coincidence that Lydia and Ray had to flee from this place, and only a week or two later, an armed force starts to stir shit up in the dark. They were probably allies of Mina's march. If he could get in contact with them, he had a better chance to spread his warning and the info on the worms, than trying to persuade the leaders of this place. There was only one good thing about the current situation: at least the worms would have a hard time entering, with the barrier blocking any access apart from the only entrance. It would be great if it didn't come with a lot of people defenselessly sitting in the open like this, and putting him before yet another problem. How would he get in? Chapter 1009 Durable Olympian Bronze. Mina's Mar. The Golem production was in full swing. However, Seth took a small break, leaving the insertion of souls to Cerberus, while he had to follow an idea of his own. The fact that the size restriction of the Golem forge was lifted simply would let him alone. How much of a torment was it, every time he tried to make massive golems? Because of this, they were forced to loot many of the bodies they brought from the colossal dungeon, without being able to use even a single one, up to now. It wasn't like they could put them in a storage or leave them to clog up their inventories. They also didn't have the number of hunters to properly dismantle them, leaving them only the loot option and to get materials out of them. Despite only getting a fraction when using the system to do it, they still ended up with several warehouses of epic materials that were left to their crafters to improve their skills. Still, Seth had kept the best bodies, and he had been thinking about what to do with them, ever since. He never had the time to work on one, and Cerberus was needed in other places. But now he could leave a lot of the work to the Golem forge. With this knowledge, his mind kept mulling over ideas of what to do with the bodies he kept, and the idea he had needed some preparations. A lot, actually. But he was sure it would be worth it. This was why he came before the furnace, which also had the size restrictions removed. He was never much of a smelter. He had accepted the doctrine of the dwarves to use the correct and pure materials for the job. Although he had mixed metals and made some alloys in the past, it was never his go-to answer for anything. But now, he needed this. Using the new knowledge of his skill, Seth enlarged the furnace. The small furnace that was about his height and enough to smelt and refine a good amount of metal, grew until it almost touched the workshop ceiling. Now it looked like a proper blast furnace, that could melt and refine a great number of ores. Had he known earlier that he would unlock this function, there would have been no need to order the stainless steel from somewhere else. Since Tort's arrival, Seth was able to leave many of the internal tasks to him and benefit from the master's centuries of knowledge. Among them was finding a use for all the mining produce they had been hogging until now. Especially ores of uncommon materials were not as attractive to their own craftsmen who had all reached at least the journeyman tier. The best plan for these was to use them for alloys, and this was what he planned on doing now. After enlarging the furnace, he started dumping in the contents of his inventory. Sacks and sacks of sunburned tin ore and cold copper ore started filling the workshop floor. They were the lower-end products of Minasmar's aggressive golem mining. Diligently, Seth started filling the furnace with a specific mix of tin ore and copper ore, with layers of flux and coal. The next step was simple: turn on the furnace and let it do its work, while he observed the heat and ventilation inside. When Tord saw the list of materials they were able to mine, this was one of the very first recipes he insisted on promoting. Although they were uncommon metals, they would lead to a rare alloy called tempered bronze. According to the Dwarven Master, tempered bronze outclassed many other metals in hardness and durability, disregarding their rating. Despite that, it was usually not very popular among adventurers, since the only effect it had, apart from being physically comparable to mithril, was a 20% increase in resistance to heat and cold. There were better materials to protect from heat or cold respectively, and they could usually come with much better options for attack or defense, as the enchantability of the bronze was also inhibited. It was not bad, with about 15% the conductivity of mithril. It was in the lower middle for conducting magic power. This meant the bonus enchantments and the output of skills that were used through items made of it would experience was much lower than when using a better material. Then why did Tord suggest it? Because it was actually a great material for making higher grade golems. The iron and steel they used on the golems sold to Arjit Noer had almost no conductivity for magic power. Compared to steel, it was 15 times better. Although it would compare to elite golems using mithril, or ithilden, it was cheaper, more durable in general, and they could make it in huge quantities. The plan was to use this alloy for the next generation of mass-produced golem knights because production took time. Until now, but Seth didn't intend to make a huge amount of bronze for a bronze army. He was looking for something bigger, and it didn't end with just the alloy. Seth's next step was experimental. The bronze was successfully made and waited to be cast. Now was the time for the experiment. The spirit blacksmith had gained confidence after succeeding in infusing souls into fabric. Now he wanted to try infusing a soul into liquid metal and essentially creating a material. It was similar to the time he smelted ancient bronze and celestial bronze. At the time, he felt the godly power that stuck to these metals during smelting. He wanted to try and replicate this effect, using his own soul infusion. Currently, the soul infused into the item would die when the weapon was destroyed by melting it down. He wanted to see whether he could prevent this, by directly infusing the soul into the molten material, making it a permanent effect on the material itself, instead of a kind of enchantment. Beforehand, he had already prepared the soul for this experiment. It was the massive soul of the crystal vine he had gotten from Tinomol. The crystal vine soul had the trait of lining fossil, increasing its defense and endurance. He enchanted it with Olympian durability. Using soul infusion, he began to feel the liquid metal inside the furnace. There were usually two methods he could use to infuse a soul: creating a soul armament with soul forging and infusing it by mixing it into the metal. He tried the first since molten metal didn't seem too different from mixing it in by folding. The molten bronze felt very different from the metal or the fabric since it was not a solid material. Seth had trouble finding a place where he could fasten the soul. From the outside, it looked like he was just leaning against the furnace, while he was trying to get an outline of what he was supposed to do. Seth could feel the liquid metal and he was sure he could infuse the soul, so he kept mulling over it as he scoured the material with his mind. He dove deeper and deeper as he consumed more mental power, but he found nothing. Was he to keep going until he reached the crystalline structure within the metal? A shiver ran down his spine, at the thought of weaving the soul into the molecular structure of the material. A fabric was already taxing, he would never be able to do molecular bonds. It simply wasn't the realm of a mortal, or he was using the wrong method. After all, these skills were originally divine blessings. He was a mortal, but these were the skills of a god. As such, he started turning the soul into a soul armament. With his previous attempt, he had a good idea of the outlines and shapes of the metal within the furnace. Applying the soul armament was different from fusing it into finished items. It felt jittery and unstable, but it calmed down after a while of him stabilizing everything and burning through his mental power using soul infusion. When it finally felt like it succeeded, it was time for the last step. Quenching in the waters of Styx. This was the easiest part. Instead of using molds to catch the bronze, he simply let the molten metal directly run into the waters of Styx. When the bronze gushed into the water with steam and loud sizzling, he almost missed the message. Ding! You have created a new material. Durable Olympian bronze. Plus 1500 power of existence. With the rise of its fame, you will also earn more power of existence in the future. The system actually acknowledged his efforts and accepted the bronze as a new material altogether. Excited, Seth picked out one of the steaming drops of bronze that were released from the bubble of water. Durable Olympian bronze, crafting material. Epic. A material created by Master Smith, the first blacksmith master of Earth. Using tempered bronze and a mysterious set of skills connected to the Olympian gods, he created a material with incredible durability. Traits: medium magic affinity, resistance to heat and cold, high durability. Good corrosion resistance. Only after seeing this, did it sink in. He succeeded, he really succeeded. Jumping up and down, with the bronze ball in his hand, he enjoyed this moment of glory. Another joyful consequence was, that he now had enough power of existence to level up to level 4. Happily, he used 15,000p of power of existence to finally rise to level 4, only to choke when he saw that the next step cost a whopping 40k points. To get to level 5 he needed more than double than before. He took a deep breath, it didn't matter. There was no need and no possibility to rush this. Seeing Sivri's questioning gaze, he explained what just happened. Surprised, the Golden Dwarf started celebrating with him. This was a great day and it was a great start for the project to come. Chapter 1010 Mike's Suspicions. Hone, I need your help with something. Not even an hour had gone by after Seth succeeded in making the bronze, when he appeared at the neighboring workshop, asking for the help of one of his dwarven colleagues. It was already late, but he found that the dwarf was still in. Hone was from a world, where dwarfs held a more modern perspective on their craft. He was also the one in charge of creating the lower-level items for the bronze anvil, since he was the one with the knowledge surrounding magical casting. The dwarf was able to create molds and casting furnaces that allowed him to directly cast accessories with simple enchantments. And this was exactly what Seth needed. The ability to mass-produce a huge number of relatively small enchanted items. Sure, what do you need? The dwarf asked, clueless about what he was going to be pulled into. But it was too late. Seth already pulled out the blueprint he had created with the help of his blueprint skill. Seth spread the scroll on the workbench close by and Hone's eyes widened when he saw the contents. Are you for real? He asked, shocked by the scale of the endeavor. Yes. And I need your help. I need you too. After roping in Hone for the job, Seth's mind finally relaxed a little and he returned to help Cerberus infuse souls into the Golem cores. They still had a lot of work to do, and it wouldn't become less once Simon came with the scrap armors. Despite the late hour, the blacksmith returned to work. Unclaimed Mountains, Emerald City. The way into the city was easier than expected. The guy he chatted up turned quite friendly and invited him to a drink after a while. Before Mike could think of any other method, his new friend offered him to join their convoy when entering. He got to meet the convoy leader, who agreed to take him along. The catboy doubted him at first, but the guard didn't bother him after the leader had a word or two with them. The man didn't even ask Mike for payment. The convoy leisurely drove into the streets of Emerald City. The beastman could only wonder about the difference between this place and the other settlements he had come past. Unlike the struggling settlements, this place and Morinta were surprisingly thriving. Well, who knew how Morinta was doing now? Do you have any plans in the city? Or are you only staying long enough to prepare for the next quest? The guy asked when he saw Mike observing the city. Right, he had gotten into the city. Now he had to think about how to continue. There are some people I heard about, but I don't know how I would contact them yet, Mike answered vaguely. It was the truth, he just didn't mention that he wanted to meet the alleged terrorists. Brother, if you have no plans or place to stay, you should come with us to our base, the guy suggested. Mike didn't have a place to stay, and it would probably take some time to get in contact with the group that was wreaking havoc on Emerald City. He had no real reason to refuse. Mike had introduced himself as a traveling swordsman, Leave 89, working as a mercenary at the Adventurers Guild. Nobody was suspecting him so far and he guessed that they would probably try to scout him. 89 was a pretty high level for most people after all. Sure, why not, he agreed lightheartedly. The convoy drove on for a while. The city wasn't small. Finally, the trucks turned to enter a subterranean parking garage. Guy, can you bring our new friend upstairs to settle him in? the convoy leader asked the man. Guy nodded and signaled for Mike to come along. Guy led him up a few stairs and brought him to a nice-looking lady. This is Martha, she manages things around here. She will show you to one of our guest rooms. Martha looked up at Mike and gave him a friendly smile when she saw his cat ears. Follow me, I have the right room for you, she said beaming a smile, and took the lead. She brought him to a room that could be called nice for a free place to stay and Spartan in general. A bare room with light parquet flooring, a simple bed, a desk, a cupboard, and a small window. To the left was also a door that led to a small bathroom with a toilet, shower, and sink, which upgraded the room by a little. Would you like to eat something? She asked after showing him the room. No, it's fine. Thanks, Mike refused politely. Then I will call you when dinner is ready. She didn't insist and quickly left. Where did you pick up that beastman? A deep voice asked the convoy leader. Guy chatted him up at the entrance to the barrier. He seems quite naive, he even lied about his level, saying he is level 89. I doubt someone with that level would act so clueless. But we should be careful, it might all just be an act, the convoy leader answered cautiously. Act or not, even if he is really level 89 it won't do him any good apart from raising his price, the dark voice said, amused at the convoy leader's concerns. It's been a while since good-looking cat people appeared on the market. Even though he's a male, he might go well as a bodyguard or combat slave for a young lady with special tastes. Outside the door, the black cat ears twitched. Mike could only sigh. Although Mike was not an assassin or a thief, his people were naturally apt to sneaking, so he had left his room to look around to calm his worries, only for them to be confirmed. He had his suspicions, but he acted innocent and trusting to give them a chance to prove him paranoid. Despite what he saw on his journey, and in Morin too, despite what he experienced with the apiaries, he had hoped there would be at least some good people out here. There probably were good people in Emerald City, but it definitely was not these guys. If these guys were catching and trading people, did that mean there were others locked up in here? Looking at the time, he decided to keep looking around. He just had to return before evening, when Martha would call him for dinner. Guessing that they had put him in the rooms that were actually meant for their employees, Mike judged that were the normal business floors. He currently had gone up, because he had spotted the convoy leader by coincidence and followed him. The floors had more rooms, even apartments, and some offices, like the one he had just been eavesdropping on. If they really held people here, they would probably be downstairs. Dungeons and prisons were famously a downstairs thing. Avoiding people's eyes, Mike snuck back down. Guy had quickly led him up the stairs before, not giving him a chance to see what the other floors looked like. But before he could enter another floor, he witnessed a peculiar scene. There was a goat, kneeling in front of a door, fiddling with the lock. A goat. He wasn't as surprised as he thought he would be. There was something familiar. He seemed to recall something about a goat and Mina's march. Didn't Seth? Excuse me, are you perhaps Mole? The goat jumped up in shock, its fur standing up as it took a fighting stance and faced Mike. However, it did not make a single sound. How do you know my name? Mole asked, not that surprised that someone snuck up on him while he was lockpicking. Lockpicking with hoofs was hard and took all his concentration. So you are Mole. I'm Mike, a lord of Mina's March. Seth told me about you, but what are you doing here? Mike had not been sure, but he tried to approach because he made the connection between a goat demon and the mysterious group of assailants that most likely were connected to Mina's March. Mike? The guy that has been off the radar for almost 2 months, the demon asked suspiciously. Ah well, my comm orb was damaged and I couldn't get in contact. Wait. That's not important. Since you are here, you must have a way to contact home, right? I have news I have to report. Mike suddenly changed the subject. He had to warn everyone about the cyber worms. Sure, but could you help me with this first? The demon asked and pointed at the door.